Hey, fourth grade. This is a quick review of the decimal place value that we studied about 2 weeks ago. And I apologize, this is going to look a little rough because the font that I used didn't translate real well into this presentation. But regardless, let's just go through a couple concepts here real quickly. So first of all, remember that decimals are representing parts that are less than one whole. So everything to the right of the decimal point is really representing a fraction, a part of a whole. Anything to the left of the decimal point is representing whole numbers, whole pizzas. When we read a decimal, there are 4 steps to doing that. First of all, we read the whole number part like it's a regular number. So we would just read this as 4, like we always have. Next, when we get to that decimal point, we use the word "and" for the decimal. And that's because the decimal is separating the whole number parts from the parts that are less than 1. So don't say point, say "and." So this would be 4 and. And then finally, whatever you have after the decimal point, you'll read that like you normally do. 1 has always been read as 11. And then we say the name of that last decimal place value. So in this case, the 11 ends in the hundreds place. So we would read it as 4 and 11 hundredths. Let's practice reading a couple more decimal numbers using the place value chart. This number would be read as 1 and 12 hundredths. This number is 1 and 12 thousandths. And notice the difference between this. This 12 ends in the thousands place, 3 digits after the decimal, whereas this one is read as 1 and 12 hundredths because it just has 2 digits after the decimal. This decimal would be read as 11 and 2 tenths. And then finally, this one would be 11 and 2 thousandths. So again, if your decimal ends in just 1 digit after the decimal, you'll say tenths at the end. If your decimal has 2 digits after the decimal point, we say it's hundredths. And if you have a decimal that has 3 digits after the decimal, then you'll use the word thousands. Let's see how that looks as actual fraction decimal grids. So again, if there's 1 digit after the decimal, it's tenths. And that means that we have a whole that is divided into 10 equal pieces. In this case, I just have one of them, so that's 1/10. If your decimal has 2 digits after the decimal, then we're talking about hundredths, which means that your whole is divided into 100 pieces. So this is what 1/100ths would look like. And then finally, if you have a decimal that is a whole that's divided into 1,000 ridiculously tiny little itty bitty pieces, that's 3 digits after the decimal point for thousandths, and that's what 1,000ths looks like. Let's look at a couple different ways that we can write or represent these numbers. So first of all, we can write them as a fraction with a numerator and denominator. We can take that fraction and write it as a decimal. We can use a decimal grid or picture to represent a number, and then we can also say that in word form. So in this particular case, we have 27 shaded out of 100 total. So as a fraction, we write that as 27 hundredths. When we take that fraction and turn it into a decimal, it's actually only the numerator of the fraction, the total number we have shaded, that we have to write to turn it into a decimal. A decimal doesn't have to have that denominator part because when you use 2 digits after the decimal, you're already telling everyone that you're using hundredths. 2 digits after the decimal is the hundredths place. So when you write it like this as a decimal, you're already telling people that it's out of 100. And then both the fraction and decimal forms are read the same way. This is 27 hundredths, whether we say it as a fraction or a decimal, whether we write it as a fraction or decimal, we read it the same way. This one is a mixed number where we have wholes that are in the ones place, and then we have our fractional leftover part that's less than 1 whole. So we would first write the total number that we have of whole pizzas. In this case, it's 3 wholes. And then we write our fraction left over. There's 30 shaded here out of 100. When we translate that into a decimal, then we would write our 3 before the decimal point for the whole pizzas, and then 30 comes after the decimal point to show how many we have shaded with 2 digits after the decimal place because we're in the hundreds. And then again, we would read the decimal and the mixed number the same, 3 and 30 hundredths. Let's look at one more example. We have one whole, and then this is divided into tenths. And we have 4 of those shaded. Oops, I've got this wrong. This should be 4, sorry. So this should be 1 and 4 tenths shaded. As a decimal, it should be 1.4, and our word form should be 1 and 4 tenths. Sorry about that. Just a reminder that you have a couple pages of notes that you can refer back to in your math notebook that will help you out if you need some extra review of this. So we have a page that looks at how to read decimals, and then we also looked at decimals to the tenths place, and then we also looked at decimals to the hundredths place, and then you have a page that reviews the thousandths place. At the bottom of your page of notes on the thousandths place, there's a little section here that we haven't gotten to, and I'll review that with you tomorrow.